Welcome back. In this episode, we will start implementing the player movement, and here is what we will have made by the end of this episode. So first, we will make the idle and run animations. For this, we will need an animator controller to maintain our animation clips and control the transitions between them. So let's go ahead and create a new folder inside the assets folder called animations. And let's create a new folder inside it called player. And now we can create an animator controller by right-click, create animator controller. And let's name it player_AC. Now to animate our player, we need to attach an animator component to it. So let's go back to our player game object and click on the player renderer. And here we can add a new component. So let's add animator and then drag the controller we've just created into the controller property. Let's now bring out the animation window from window, animation, animation, and let's drag it to the bottom here. Now let's select the player renderer game object. And inside the animation window here, let's click on create. So this will create a new animation for us. So make sure we're in the player folder under the animations folder. And let's name this one idle. Now we can go ahead and drag our sprites to create animation frames. So let's click on the record button right here. Make sure we're at the first frame. Then we go to the player renderer game object. Let's change the sprite into idle outline. But since it's already the selected sprite right here, this will not change anything. So to insert the keyframe, we need just to change it and then go back to it. So as you can see here, it inserted a new keyframe. So let's repeat the same thing with the skin and the clothes game objects. So we change the sprite into the idle skin. And finally, for the clothes, the idle clothes. So now we can stop recording. Now let's create a new clip for running. So create a new clip. Let's name it run. And we can now go to the idle animation and copy the first frame and just paste it here because both animations have the same first frame. Now we can go to the next frame and start recording. So for the player renderer, we will have run one outline. For the skin, run one skin. And for the clothes, run one clothes. Then let's go to the next frame. Repeat the same process. So run to clothes, run to skin, and run to outline. And for the last frame, we have run 3 outline, run 3 skin, and run 3 clothes. So now we can stop recording and let's play to test it. Now we have a run animation as well, and we can start writing some code to make the player move. So now let's create a new folder under the assets folder titled scripts. And let's create another folder inside it. And let's call it player. Inside this folder, we will put all the scripts related to the player. So now let's create our first script inside the player folder. So right click, create C# script. And let's name it player controller. So this script will be our main script for the player, and then we will break up our logic to some subscripts. So here we have a player input script, ground movement, collision detection, etc. And as you can see, they're all connected to the player controller script and can only communicate through it. This is a great way to organize our code and keep things clean. So now let's create 2 new scripts, which are going to be subscripts of the player controller. So the first one is going to be the player input script. And the other one is the ground movement script. Very nice. So now let's open the 3 of them in Visual Studio. Alright, so now let's go to the player controller. And inside this script, which is our main script, we need to create references to the subscripts we created. But first, let's remove the default functions to start clean. And at the top here, let's create a public player input variable. Let's call it player input. Let's also add the public ground movement. And let's name it ground movement. So now to set up the references between the scripts, we need to use the awake function. So let's go inside the awake function. And let's set the player input equal to get component of type player input. and the ground movement equal to get component of type ground movement. Next, let's go to the player input script and let's remove the default functions. And now the first thing we have to do is connecting this script to the player controller script. So let's create a private reference to our player controller script. Let's set it in the awake function. So as you may have guessed, this script will be responsible for the player input. So at the top here, for the horizontal movement, let's add a public float and let's name it horizontal movement. And let's add the update function. So the update function is called every frame. That's why we use it to detect and receive inputs. So now inside the update function, to get the player input, we type input dot. Then we use the get axis row function. And we specify the horizontal axis. The get axis row function returns 0, 1, or -1, depending on the player input. So for the horizontal axis, if you press the right arrow key or the D key on the keyboard, it will return 1. If you press the left arrow key or the A key, it will return -1. And if you press nothing, it will return 0. Similarly, if you are using a controller, by moving the left stick, the values are changing. So now let's save the value of the horizontal input inside our variable. And that's all we need to do for now. So now let's go to the ground movement script and also remove the default functions to start clean. And at the top here, let's add a reference to our player controller as we did in the player input script. So private player controller, and we set it in the awake function. Now to move our player, we will need a rigid body. A rigid body should be added to moving game objects to allow them to be affected by physics. And rigid bodies are also used to handle collision detection. So let's go back to Unity. Select the player game object and let's add a new component. So we choose rigid body 2D. Now we can go to the player controller script and now let's add a reference to our rigid body. So first we create a public rigid body variable and we made it public to be able to access it from the ground movement script. So let's name it RB, and then inside the awake function, let's cache it. So RB is equal to get component rigid body 2D. Now let's also make a public float for the movement speed. And before things get messy, let's use headers to organize our code a bit. So let's add a new header. Let's call this one subscripts. And we will have another one for our components. And one more for our player data. So let's save. Yeah, and also let's save the player input script and the ground movement as well. So now inside the ground movement script, we can start making our movement. So to make the player movement, we have 3 things to do. First, we need to set up the rigid body velocity to make the player move. Then we need to make the player flip when changing directions. And finally, we need to switch between the run and idle animations depending on the input. So let's start with the first step. Now inside the update function, we will set the rigid body velocity by typing player controller.rb.velocity is equal to a new vector2. Now a vector2 has 2 values, x and y. And to move an object horizontally, we need to move it along the x-axis only. So that's why the x value is going to be our horizontal input. So let's get it from the player controller.playerInput.horizontal movement. And then we multiply it by the movement speed, which is inside the player controller.movement speed. And for the y value, we won't change anything. So we will just write player controller.rb.velocity.y. Now the next step is flipping our player when changing directions. So for that we will need a direction variable to know exactly which direction our player is facing. So I'll go back to the player controller script. And under the player data, let's add a public int called forward direction. So the value of this variable is going to be 1 when the player is facing right and -1 when the player is facing left. So by default, let's set the value to 1 because our player is facing right. So an easy way to flip any 2D game object is by changing the value of the local scale on the x-axis. So if you try to test this with our player, so as you can see when the value is 1, our player is facing right. And if I go ahead and change it to -1, he's now facing left. And if we set it back to 1, he's now facing right. So let's control that with our code. So inside the ground movement script, after we set our velocity, if our horizontal input is less than 0 and the player is facing right, so the forward direction is 1. So in this case, we set the local scale to a new vector 3, where the x value is -1. And we also change the forward direction to -1, because our player is facing left now. And else if the horizontal input is greater than 0 and the player is facing left, so the forward direction is -1. So in this case, our local scale is going to be a new vector 3, where x is 1. And we also set the forward direction to 1, because he's facing right. So let's save the changes. And one more thing we have to do before we start testing this is adding a collider to our player. So let's go to the player game object and let's add a box collider 2D. Let's go to the scene view. So let's change the size. So now we want the player to interact with the ground, so we can add a new layer. So let's name it player. So now we can go to the player and change the layer to player. Select yes. So now to set up the interactions between our layers, we can go to edit, project settings, and then go to physics 2D. And if you go down a bit, you can see the layers here. So for the player, let's uncheck everything except for the ground. And for the ground also, let's uncheck everything. Yeah. So now let's close it. Now we can attach our scripts to our player. So let's drag the player controller, and then the player input, and the ground movement. So for the speed, let's try something like 5 for now. Yeah, that's it. Now let's hit play. So we can see that our player can move and flip directions. Awesome. So with that, we finish this part and we will continue in the next one. So if you found this video useful, consider hitting the like button, subscribe to the channel, and push that bell icon to get notified when the next episode is out. Never forget to save your projects, and I'll see you next time.